There are two principles that can be used to integrate knowledge, and they are fundamentally opposed. There is one principle of evolution and the other principle of redemption. These two principles are basically the ways that things can be integrated. So, for example, people like Father Pierre Teilhard de Chardin spoke about how evolution is not merely a theory, but is the means by which one would think. And so, in the same way, a framework like redemption is a means by which one would think. These are both principles of integration, means of understanding how to bring ideas together. People like Ken Wilber, for example, the integral movement, is who I might call the St. Thomas Aquinas of the New Age. He has a very interesting system based on essentially, how do you integrate knowledge? And this type of a system is based on the fundamental assumption, if you look into it, essentially, I think it's based on this assumption that everything has the same nature, that one thing can change into another thing, and that there's no difference between human nature and divine nature. These are fundamental assumptions that undergird this type of an understanding of evolution as a means of integrating knowledge. And so, for example, in his approach, he takes various developmental psychologies and puts them into this big framework and kind of links everything together into this framework of people developing through these different levels of consciousness throughout time, essentially ascending from one level to another until people are more fully evolved. And these type of thoughts, are in line with those of Father Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. These are, the product of various types of thinkers. But the essential underlying assumption is this understanding of one thing is progressing into another thing, or this sense of evolution. The other thing that we can use in order to integrate knowledge is to really understand that there are two things. There's divine nature and human nature, or even that there are things like, animal nature is separate from human nature. The nature of the creation is separate, So there's these understandings of that natures are different. So, for example, human nature, divine nature, angelic nature, animal nature, plant nature, these things are different. And this is a much different paradigm that doesn't say one thing can become another. Now, this video is not, there's a lot of work done on the natural science side of this, and you can look and see pretty good explanations of how geology and how natural science, you can dismiss evolutionary theory on those grounds. You can do it. But the thing really and you can look at things from Hugh Owen, for example, the Colby Center. You can look at those things, but the important thing here is to realize that people like, if you look at the process of the covenant, God makes a covenant with Abraham, for example, and he says, all the nations of the earth will be blessed through him, and this is the purpose of Israel. The purpose of Israel ultimately becomes this place in which eventually this distinction between the Gentiles will be integrated into Israel. It's not like they lose their nature as Gentile, but they become part of the nation of Israel. So there's this very different process that happens. Essentially, one thing takes up another thing, and we see this as the very principle of the incarnation. This understanding that God becomes man, and that eventually there is this way in which the divine nature takes on a human nature, assumes a human nature. And there's this procedure that goes on where you see, just like the divine nature assumes the human nature, the nation of Israel through Christ assumes the Gentiles, which then we see that the church then assume the culture and structures of the Roman Empire, becoming Christendom and the Roman Church. We see these things kind of becoming incarnate things. We see this also in ways in which throughout history you see apparitions of the Virgin Mary, where she appears, so for example, Our Lady of Guadalupe, we see her in the outfit of kind of clothed with Aztec imagery. We see this way in which the culture is taken up, things are taken up, other things that are outside are taken up. And we can see this also in the work of people like St. Thomas Aquinas, where he takes this essential, like he takes Aristotle, a pagan philosopher, and he then integrates Aristotle and elevates Aristotle even better than Aristotle was by integrating him with Catholic thought. So there's all these different ways in which we can see this principle of the incarnation, this covenantal principle at work. And the real thing is that the essential thing is really important to understand that there's a difference between the tradition and the thing being integrated. There's a difference between the divine nature, there's a superiority of the divine nature over the human nature being assumed. And so we have to understand that there's a real valuing of tradition here. It's not about, just kind of progress. It's about redemption. It's about harmonizing everything with the tradition. And the tradition is the core. And the thing that we also want to see, though, is the core of this, going back even to Abraham, it's not so much, the Israelites are a nation set apart, but for the purpose of blessing everything. The thing is that we just want to understand our vocation, to understand the vocation of tradition. We don't want to have a sense of tradition that forgets its vocation to redeem other things. Just like we don't want to be like the Pharisees who thought they were, they kind of were, I'd say, okay, we're special, we're different, we're set apart because we're following the tradition. We don't want to be set apart, we want to set the world on fire. And that's the thing, we don't want this kind of, just like, the heresy of modernism is what we call the essence, the synthesis of all heresy, because it involves this evolutionary principle. One of the popes talked about how evolution is the principal philosophy of modernism, because it says that one thing can become another thing, can become another kind of thing. Of course, animals can adapt. Of course, doctrine develops in the church. Of course, there's a microevolution, but doctrine or animals don't become another kind of thing. In the same way, we could see authentic development of doctrine, or even we could see there's a lot of different things. Like there's a very good example of this, but I don't know if I'll share it right now. But you could see these type of principles at work. So we don't want to, on one hand, become traditionalists who don't use the tradition to redeem outside things. We want to do what St. Thomas did, not only say what St. Thomas said, but we should also say what St. Thomas said. We need to do what St. Thomas did to other philosophies. We need to integrate them and up-level them so they become more of what they are, and we become, the tradition becomes more of what it can be. We don't minimize the tradition, supplant the tradition. We supplement the tradition. We take in other things. We redeem other things. We follow the principle of the incarnation, the crucifixion, the resurrection. These kind of redemptive, covenantal, incarnational principles. We don't follow a principle of evolution where one thing becomes another thing. We follow a principle of redemption where two things are joined together and one thing is superior. The divine nature, the church, the faith is superior to the other thing. And there's a way in which there's something very important about the human nature of Christ, that there's something very important about the new ideologies, even the thoughts of Aristotle. There's something important about these things. We need to take these things in, but we need to take them in, but we can't take in this other integrated principle of evolution because it's antithetical to the whole project of integration. So that's the interesting thing. We can use this. This is, I think, the core of this thing, that we have this choice between the principle of integration that is evolution and the principle of integration that is this covenantal, redemptive, incarnational, crucifixion, resurrection principle that allows us to take in different ideas and redeem them and make them better and make the tradition grow. So that's the general idea here. So I just wanted to share that.